How do organisms reproduce? Introduction. Reproduction, process whereby all living organisms produce offspring. Reproduction is one of the essential functions of plants, animals, and single-celled organisms, as necessary for the preservation of the species as eating is for the preservation of the individual. In almost all animal organisms, reproduction occurs during or after the period of maximum growth. In plants which continue to grow throughout their lifetime, the relationship between growth and reproduction is more complex. Individual plants have growth limitations imposed by inherited characteristics and environmental conditions. If the plant grows excessively, any of a number of reproductive processes may be stimulated. Environmental conditions also play some part in the reproduction of higher animals, but hormonal elements are more important. Asexual reproduction. Most single-celled organisms reproduce by a process known as fission, in which the parent organism splits into two or more so-called daughter organisms, thereby losing its original identity. Cell division, which results in the multiplication of cells constituting the tissues, organs, and systems of a multicellular organism, is not considered true reproduction. It is almost identical, however, with the binary fission of single-celled organisms. In certain multicellular animals such as the cnidarians, sponges, and tunicates, cell division often results in the production of buds that arise from the body of the parent and then later separate to develop into a new organism identical with the parent. This process, known as germination, is analogous to the process of vegetative reproduction or propagation in plants. Reproductive processes, such as those cited above, in which only one parent gives rise to the offspring, are scientifically classified as asexual reproduction. The offspring produced are identical with the parent. Sexual reproduction. A number of single-celled organisms multiply by conjugation. In this process, which is analogous to fertilization, two similar unicellular organisms fuse, exchange nuclear materials, and then break apart. Each organism then reproduces by fission. Occasionally, after conjugation, the participating organisms do not reproduce, the process in these instances seeming merely to revitalize the organisms. Conjugation is the most primitive method of sexual reproduction by which organisms having genetic characteristics derived from two parents are produced. Most multicellular animals and plants undergo a more complex form of sexual reproduction in which especially differentiated male and female reproductive cells or gametes unite to form a single cell known as a zygote, which later undergoes successive divisions to form a new organism. The terms fecundation and fertilization are applied to the union of the male and female cells. In this form of sexual reproduction, half the genes, the carriers of inheritable characteristics in the zygote, come from one parent and half from the other parent. Do organisms create exact copies of themselves? Organisms look similar because their body designs are similar. If body designs are to be similar, the blueprints for these designs should be similar. Thus, reproduction at its most basic level will involve making copies of the blueprints of body design. In class 9, we learned that the chromosomes in the nucleus of a cell contain information for inheritance, if features from parents to next generation, in the form of DNA molecules. The DNA in the cell nucleus is the information source for making proteins. If the information is changed, different proteins will be made. Different proteins will eventually lead to altered body designs. Therefore, a basic event in reproduction is the creation of a DNA copy. Cells use chemical reactions to build copies of their DNA. This creates two copies of the DNA in a reproducing cell, and they will need to be separated from each other. However, keeping one copy of DNA in the original cell and simply pushing the other one out would not work because the copy pushed out would not have any organized cellular structure for maintaining life processes. Therefore, DNA copying is accompanied by the creation of an additional cellular apparatus, and then the DNA copies separate, each with its own cellular apparatus. Effectively, a cell divides to give rise to two cells. These two cells are of course similar, but are they likely to be absolutely identical? The answer to this question will depend on how accurately the copying reactions involved occur. No biochemical reaction is absolutely reliable. Therefore, it is only to be expected that the process of copying the DNA will have some variations each time. As a result, the DNA copies generated will be similar, but may not be identical to the original. Some of these variations might be so drastic that the new DNA copy cannot work with the cellular apparatus it inherits. Such a newborn cell will simply die. On the other hand, there could still be many other variations in the DNA copies that would not lead to such a drastic outcome. Thus, the surviving cells are similar to but subtly different from each other. This inbuilt tendency for variation during reproduction is the basis for evolution, as we will discuss in the next chapter. The importance of variation. Populations of organisms fill well-defined places or niches in the ecosystem using their ability to reproduce. The consistency of DNA copying during reproduction is important for the maintenance of body design features that allow the organism to use that particular niche. Reproduction is therefore linked to the stability of populations of species. However, niches can change because of reasons beyond the control of the organisms. Temperatures on Earth can go up or down, water levels can vary, or there could be meteorite hits, to think of a few examples. If a population of reproducing organisms were suited to a particular niche, and if the niche were drastically altered, the population could be wiped out. However, if some variations were to be present in a few individuals in these populations, thus, if there were a population of bacteria living in temperature waters, and if water temperature were to be increased by global warming, most of these bacteria would die. But the few variants resistant to heat would survive and grow further. Variation is thus useful for the survival of species over time. Modes of reproduction used by the single organisms. Fission. For unicellular organisms, cell division or fission leads to the creation of new individuals. Many different patterns of fission have been observed. Many bacteria and protozoa simply split into two equal halves during cell division. In organisms such as amoeba, the splitting of the two cells during division can take place in any plane. However, some unicellular organisms show somewhat more organization of their bodies, such as is seen in leishmania, which cause kala azar, which have a whip-like structure at one end of the cell. In such organisms, binary fission occurs in a definite orientation in relation to these structures. Other single-celled organisms, such as the malarial parasite Plasmodium, divide into many daughter cells simultaneously by multiple fission. Yeast, on the other hand, can put out small buds that separate and grow further. Fragmentation. In multicellular organisms with relatively simple body organization, simple reproductive methods can still work. Spirogyra, for example, simply breaks up into smaller pieces upon maturation. These pieces or fragments grow into new individuals. This is not true for all multicellular organisms. They cannot simply divide cell by cell. The reason is that many multicellular organisms, as we have seen, are not simply a random collection of cells. Specialized cells are organized as tissues, and tissues are organized into organs which then have to be placed at definite positions in the body. In such a carefully organized situation, cell-by-cell division would be impractical. Multicellular organisms therefore needed to use more complex ways of reproduction. A basic strategy used in multicellular organisms is that different cell types perform different specialized functions. Following this general pattern, reproduction in such organisms is also the function of a specific cell type. How is reproduction to be achieved from a single cell type if the organism itself consists of many cell types? The answer is that there must be a single cell type in the organism that is capable of growing, proliferating, and making other cell types under the right circumstances. Regeneration. Many fully differentiated organisms have the ability to give rise to new individual organisms from their body parts. That is, if the individual is somehow cut or broken up into many pieces, many of these pieces grow into separate individuals. For example, simple animals like Hydra and Planaria can be cut into any number of pieces, and each piece grows into a complete organism. This is known as regeneration. Regeneration is carried out by specialized cells. These cells proliferate and make large numbers of cells. From this mass of cells, different cells undergo changes to become various cell types and tissues. These changes take place in an organized sequence referred to as development. However, regeneration is not the same as reproduction, since most organisms would not normally depend on being cut up to be able to reproduce. Budding. Organisms such as Hydra use regenerative cells for reproduction in the process of budding. In Hydra, a bud develops as an outgrowth due to repeated cell division at one specific site. These buds develop into tiny individuals and, when fully mature, detach from the parent body and become new independent individuals. Vegetation propagation. There are many plants in which parts like the root, stem, and leaves develop into new plants under appropriate conditions. Unlike in most animals, plants can indeed use such a mode for reproduction. This property of vegetative propagation is used in methods such as layering or grafting to grow many plants like sugarcane, roses, or grapes for agricultural purposes. Plants raised by vegetative propagation can bear flowers and fruits earlier than those produced from seeds, such as banana, orange, rose, and jasmine that have lost the capacity to produce seeds. Another advantage of vegetative propagation is that all plants produced are genetically similar enough to the parent plant to have all its characteristics. Similarly, buds produced in the notches along the leaf margin of bryophyllum fall on the soil and develop into new plants. Spore formation. Even in many simple multicellular organisms, specific reproductive parts can be identified. The thread-like structures that developed the bread in above are the hyphae of the bread mold. They are not reproductive parts. On the other hand, the tiny blob-on-a-stick structures are involved in reproduction. The blobs are sporangia, which contain cells or spores that can eventually develop into new rhizopus individuals. The spores are covered by thick walls that protect them until they come into contact with another moist surface and can begin to grow. All the modes of reproduction that we have discussed so far allow new generations to be created from a single individual. This is known as asexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction. We are also familiar with modes of reproduction that depend on the involvement of two individuals before a new generation can be created. Bulls alone cannot produce new calves, nor can hens alone produce new chicks. In such cases, both sexes, males and females, are needed to produce new generations. What is the significance of this sexual mode of reproduction? Are there any limitations of the asexual mode of reproduction which we have been discussing above? Sexual reproduction in flowering plants. The reproductive parts of angiosperms are located in the flower. We have already studied the different parts of a flower: sepals, petals, stamens and carpels. Stamens and carpels are the reproductive parts of a flower which contain the germ cells. What possible functions could the petals and sepals serve? The flower may be unisexual like in papaya or watermelon when it contains either stamens or carpels, or bisexual as in hibiscus or mustard when it contains both stamens and carpels. Stamens is the male reproductive part and it produces pollen grains that are yellowish in color. You must have seen this yellowish powder that often sticks to our hands if we touch the stamen of a flower. Carpel is present in the center of a flower and is the female reproductive part. It is made of three parts. The swollen bottom part is the ovary, middle elongated part is the style, and the terminal part, which may be sticky, is the stigma. The ovary contains ovules and each ovule has an egg cell. The male germ cell produced by pollen grain fuses with the female gamete present in the ovule. This fusion of the germ cells or fertilization gives us the zygote, which is capable of growing into a new plant. Thus, the pollen needs to be transferred from the stamen to the stigma. If this transfer of pollen occurs in the same flower, it is referred to as self-pollination. On the other hand, if the pollen is transferred from one flower to another, it is known as cross-pollination. This transfer of pollen from one flower to another is achieved by agents like wind, water, or animals. After the pollen lands on a suitable stigma, it has to reach the female germ cells which are in the ovary. For this, a tube grows out of the pollen grain and travels through the style to reach the ovary. After fertilization, the zygote divides several times to form an embryo within the ovule. The ovule develops a tough coat and is gradually converted into a seed. The ovary grows rapidly and ripens to form a fruit. Meanwhile, the petals, sepals, stamens, style and stigma may shrivel and fall off. Have you ever observed any flower part still persisting in the fruit? Try and work out the advantages of seed formation for the plant. The seed contains the future plant or embryo, which develops into a seedling under appropriate conditions. The process is known as germination. Reproduction in human beings. Male reproductive system. The male reproductive system consists of portions which produce the germ cells and other portions that deliver the germ cells to the site of fertilization. The formation of germ cells or sperms take place in the testes. These are located outside the abdominal cavity in scrotum because sperm formation requires a lower temperature than the normal body temperature. We have discussed the role of the testes in the secretion of the hormone testosterone in the previous chapter. In addition to regulating the formation of sperms, testosterone brings about changes in appearance seen in boys at the time of puberty. The sperms formed are delivered through the vas deferens, which unites with the tube coming from the urinary bladder. The urethra thus forms a common passage for both the sperm and urine. Along the path of the vas deferens, glands like the prostate and the seminal vesicles add their secretions so that the sperms are now in a fluid which makes their transport easier, and this fluid also provides nutrition. The sperms are tiny bodies that consist of mainly genetic material and a long tail that helps them to move towards the female germ cells. Female reproductive system. The female germ cells or eggs are made in the ovaries. They are also responsible for the production of some hormones. Look are and identify the various organs in the female reproductive system. When a girl is born, the ovaries already contain thousands of immature eggs. On reaching puberty, some of these start maturing. One egg is produced every month by one of the ovaries. The egg is carried from the ovary to the womb through a thin oviduct of fallopian tube. The two oviducts unite into an elastic bag-like structure known as the uterus. The uterus opens into the vagina through the cervix. The sperms enter through the vaginal passage during sexual intercourse. They travel upwards and reach the oviduct where they may encounter the egg. The fertilized egg, the zygote, gets implanted in the lining of the uterus and starts dividing. We have seen in earlier sections that the mother's body is designed to undertake the development of the child. Hence, the uterus prepares itself every month to receive and nurture the growing embryo. The lining thickens and is richly supplied with blood to nourish the growing embryo. The embryo gets nutrition from the mother's blood with the help of a special tissue called placenta. This is a disc which is embedded in the uterine wall. It contains villi on the embryo's side of the tissue. On the mother's side are blood spaces which surround the villi. This provides a large surface area for glucose and oxygen to pass from the mother to the embryo. The developing embryo will also generate waste substance which can be removed by transferring them into the mother's blood through the placenta. The development of the child inside the mother's body takes approximately 9 months. The child is born as a result of rhythmic contractions of the muscles in the uterus. What happens when the egg is not fertilized? If the egg is not fertilized, it lives for about 1 day. Since the ovary releases 1 egg every month, the uterus also prepares itself every month to receive a fertilized egg. Thus, its lining becomes thick and spongy. This would be required for nourishing the embryo if fertilization had taken place. Now, however, this lining is not needed any longer. So, the lining slowly breaks and comes out through the vagina as blood and mucus. This cycle takes place roughly every month and is known as menstruation. It usually lasts for about 2 to 8 days. Reproductive health. As we have seen, the process of sexual maturation is gradual and takes place while general body growth is still going on. Therefore, some degree of sexual maturation does not necessarily mean that the body or the mind is ready for sexual acts or for having and bringing up children. How do we decide if the body or the mind is ready for this major responsibility? All of us are under many different kinds of pressures about these issues. There can be pressure from our friends for participating in many activities whether we really want to or not. There can be pressure from the government agencies to avoid having children. In this situation, making choices can become very difficult. We must also consider the possible health consequences of having sex. We have discussed in class 9 that diseases can be transmitted from person to person in a variety of ways. Since the sexual act is a very intimate connection of bodies, it is not surprising that many diseases can be sexually transmitted. These include bacterial infections such as gonorrhea and syphilis, and viral infections such as warts and HIV/AIDS. Is it possible to prevent the transmission of such diseases during the sexual act? Using a covering called a condom for the penis during sex helps to prevent transmission of many of this infection to some extent. The sexual act always has the potential to lead to pregnancy. Pregnancy makes major demands on the body and the mind of the woman, and if she is not ready for it, her health will be adversely affected. Therefore, many ways have been devised to avoid pregnancy. These contraceptive methods fall in a number of categories. One category is the creation of a mechanical barrier so that sperm does not reach the egg. Condoms on the penis or similar coverings worn in the vagina can serve this purpose. Another category of contraceptives acts by changing the hormonal balance of the body so that eggs are not released and fertilization cannot occur. These drugs commonly need to be taken orally as pills. However, since they change hormonal balances, they can cause side effects too. Other contraceptive devices such as the loop or the copper T are placed in the uterus to prevent pregnancy. Again, they can cause side effects due to irritation of the uterus. If the vas deferens in the male is blocked, sperm transfer will be prevented. If the fallopian tube in the female is blocked, the egg will not be able to reach the uterus. In both cases, fertilization will not take place. Surgical methods can be used to create such blocks. While surgical methods are safe in the long run, surgery itself can cause infections and other problems if not performed properly. Surgery can also be used for removal of unwanted pregnancies. These may be misused by people who do not want a particular child, as happens in illegal sex-selective abortion of female fetuses. For a healthy society, the female-male sex ratio must be maintained. We have noted earlier that reproduction is the process by which organisms increase their populations. The rates of birth and death in a given population will determine its size. The size of the human population is a cause for concern for many people. This is because an expanding population makes it harder to improve everybody's standard of living. However, if inequality in society is the main reason for poor standards of living for many people, the size of the population is relatively unimportant. If we look around us, what can we identify as the most important reasons for poor living standards?